Tonight, I would like to talk about some of the research that's being done on meditation. I would like to demystify the concept according to the scientific model. And I believe that science is the contemporary language of mysticism. I think science is the greatest way to explain the unexplainable. And if you blend the concepts of quantum physics that says that your subjective mind has an effect on the objective world, and you combine it with the concepts of neuroplasticity, in other words, the brain has physical changes every time you learn something new or have new experiences or make new choices or demonstrate new behaviors or embrace new emotions, there are neurochemical changes, physical evidence that there's been some shift in consciousness. And consciousness leaves a footprint in the brain, and that's called the synaptic connection. That these concepts of psychoneuroimmunology and epigenetics all point the finger at possibility. And if you can combine those concepts, we're talking about knowledge. And knowledge is power, but knowledge about yourself is self-empowerment. And so tonight I'd like to demystify some concepts in meditation. And then I want to show you tomorrow night some of the research that we've been doing over the last 2 years in studying common people doing the uncommon. And I brought in teams of researchers and scientists and technicians in my advanced workshops because we were seeing so many supernatural changes in people's health and in their lives that I wanted to begin to measure it. And when I began to measure the changes, we were all astounded to see the results that people were producing. And so I want to start off by laying some foundations this evening, and then tomorrow I'll show you some of the neuroscience and some of the research and show you how powerful you really are in the process of transformation. How does that sound? So the word meditation, if you look up that word in the Tibetan culture, the word meditation literally means, that symbol literally means to become familiar with. Familiarization. So if you're sitting in your meditation and you all of a sudden start to notice certain thoughts that aren't serving you, and those thoughts are coming up every single day, and all of a sudden, instead of putting your attention on those thoughts as if they were true, you began to observe those thoughts, then it would beg the question, who's doing the observing? In other words, you're not the program in that moment, but you are beginning to become the consciousness observing the program, and you begin to objectify your subjective self. And if you sat down in a meditation every day, and you became aware of your urges and your propensities and the things that you wanted to do, and the body, the animal, you were making it sit there, stay, don't go, and keep bringing it back to the present moment, the more conscious you become of those unconscious behaviors and habits, the more you are knowing yourself and you're becoming familiar with the old self. And if you could pay attention to the emotions of impatience and frustration and unworthiness and self-doubt, and you became conscious that those emotions are just residue from past experiences, and the body has been conditioned to be the mind of those emotions, and you kept bringing the body back into the present moment, and you were not settling for the body as the mind. If you kept doing that, would you agree you would begin to become more familiar with the old self, so that in your waking day, in your conscious life, you wouldn't let any thought slip by your awareness to cause you to go unconscious again? And the research that's being done at Yale University has proven that when people move into a state of meditation and they find the present moment, there are specific circuits in your brain called the default mode networks. And those default mode networks are the chatter that you hear in your head all day long, the voice that's talking to you. And just 20 to 30 minutes of meditation, and average people began to shut off the default mode mechanisms and networks in their brain. Well, that would make sense because the whole purpose of meditation is to get beyond the analytical mind, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But here's the cool part. Those people who are able to shut those networks off and the chatter in their head, the voice that was always talking to them, shut off during their meditation, that network stayed off the remainder of the day while they were interacting in their environment, which means they're less analytical, they're less judgmental, they're less critical, because the very circuits in their brain that usually fire have been tempered in their meditation. How many people understand that? So then, when you begin to become familiar with your old self, and you begin to observe it, you become more conscious of your unconscious self. It means you're less likely to go unconscious in your waking day. And if you began to ask yourself a simple question like, what is the greatest ideal of myself that I can be today? What is the greatest contribution I could present to the world today? How could I live this day as one great life? And you began to think about a new way of being. And you began to plan your actions. And you began to contemplate what you learned philosophically. Because knowledge is the precursor to experience. And as you begin to review what you're no longer going to do, and you begin to think about what you are going to do, you silence the circuits in your brain that are connected to the old self, and nerve cells that no longer fire together no longer wire together, and you're literally pruning apart the circuits that are connected to the old you. And as you begin to plan your behaviors and think about a new way of being, and as you begin to mentally rehearse how you're going to live that day, the research shows that when you begin to rehearse in your mind, your brain begins to look like the experience has already occurred. And as I said last night, once you begin to install those neurological circuits, you're putting the hardware in place. If you keep revisiting them, nerve cells that fire together, wire together, you begin to install a software program and you prime your brain into the future. Now you warmed your brain up. And if you practice that every day, it would begin to become familiar to you. And if you said to yourself, how would the mystic, the saint, a holy person, the great leader, live her day or his day today? And you began to teach your body emotionally what that future would feel like ahead of the actual experience, your body, as the unconscious mind, would begin to believe it's living in that future reality in the present moment, and you're signaling new genes in new ways because the chemical feedback that you're creating by thought alone, your body literally is getting new information. And when that occurs, your body is literally beginning to live in the future. And once those genes are signaled, those genes make new proteins, and now your body's prepared for the event. And if you practice loving kindness and compassion and strength and conviction and empowerment and invincibility and self-love every single day, and you cultivated those chemical states and you practiced it over and over again, it would begin to become familiar to you. And so the process of transformation is unlearning and relearning. It's breaking the habit of the old self and reinventing a new self. It's pruning synaptic connections, as we say in neuroscience, and sprouting new connections. It's unfiring and unwiring, and refiring and rewiring. It's unmemorizing emotions that are stored in the body, and then recondition the body to a new mind and to a new emotion. It's literally pulling your energy out of the past and beginning to set your energy and your intention into a new future. And so then, to become familiar with is the Tibetan word for meditation. In Sanskrit, the word means to cultivate self. So think about this. If you were going to plant a garden, and you looked at the garden from last year, and you saw the dead plants from the past year, and the weeds that had grown because no one was paying attention, and you noticed the rocks that sifted to the top, that blocked the flow of life, and you saw the soil was hardened and uncultivated, and you cast seeds, planted seeds, and threw them on that garden, what type of fruit would you yield? But if you began to pull out those plants from the past, and you began to look at those weeds of unconscious thoughts that have been slipping by your attention every single day, because you've been too distracted by your environment. And you began to move those blocks, that emotional blocks that block the flow of the divine in you. And you began to soften and temper the soil like the body. Now you're ready to plant seeds. And so to know thyself is the concept of meditation. And the more we begin to build a new idea based on ancient wisdom about what mystics and saints have known about for thousands of years, then people will begin to do the supernatural. And I have been studying these concepts for many, many years, and I can tell you finally that this is a time in history where people no longer just want to know, they want to know how. And as you begin to apply these principles in your life, you get to reap the benefits of your own efforts. How many people are with me? Now, human beings live in two states of mind. They either live in a state of survival or they live in a state of creation. Now, living in survival is living in stress. And when you're living in stress, your body is knocked out of homeostasis. Stress is when your body is knocked out of balance. The stress response is what your body innately does to return itself back to order. Now, you have three types of stress. You have physical stress, like accidents, traumas, injuries, falls, sprains, strains. You have chemical stress, like bacteria and viruses, flus, fevers, blood sugar levels, hormones and foods, hangovers. And then you have psychological or emotional stress. Traffic jams, internet connections, second mortgages, single parenting, 401ks, family tragedies. And in all of those things, the brain and body are knocked out of balance. Now, all organisms in nature can tolerate short-term stress. When the zebra perceives the lion in the Serengeti, the moment the zebra perceives the predator, she turns on a primitive nervous system called the fight-or-flight nervous system, or the sympathetic nervous system, and she mobilizes enormous amounts of energy to prepare herself for some threat in her external environment, and the body goes into emergency mode. Are you with me? And the body's knocked out of balance. The pupils dilate, the salivary juices shut down, the digestive juices shut down, the heart rate and respiratory rate increases, blood is sent to the extremities, and now what's happening is the body is taking energy and beginning to mobilize it into hormones. And it requires an enormous amount of effort, and the body's depleted of energy. And for the short term, it's okay, because if the zebra outruns the lion, 15 minutes later, it goes back to grazing and the stress is over and the body returns back to balance. Now, human beings are a little different because if you had a difficult situation with a coworker or with your boss and you have a memory of that conflict, the moment you begin to recognize that particular person in that particular place, and you begin to react emotionally to that person, you begin to turn on the same mechanisms as if you're being chased by a predator. And what was once very adaptive in survival now becomes very maladaptive. Because when you turn on the stress response and you can't turn it off, you're headed for some disease. Because no organism in nature could live in emergency mode for extended periods of time. And so then, with human beings, it gets a little bit more complicated. Because we can turn on the stress response just by thought alone. You can begin to think about some past bitter memory that's tattooed in the recesses of your gray matter, and like magic, it comes to life. And in that moment, it's real. And as you begin to think about that memory, you produce the same chemistry in your brain and body as if the event was happening. And you are conditioning your body into the past. And the body's moving out of balance by thought alone. Or you can begin to forecast some future worst-case scenario. And you can attend to it to the exclusion of everything else. And when you make that thought more real than anything else, your body begins to make the very specific chemicals to match that thought and your body is prepared for some emergency situation in the future, and your body's knocked out of balance just by thought alone. And so human beings then, in survival, because of the large neocortex, when those chemicals begin to run, guess what we do? We pick the worst situation possible, and we prepare ourselves for the worst event. And when we get it right, we say to everybody, see how smart I am? You need to hang out with me. I see I was ready. But what happens when it doesn't happen? What happens when you're predicting something terrible to happen every day in your life because you're predicting the future because of a past memory? What happens is the body's conditioned to miss the present moment. And the person's future is their past. And if we keep doing this for an extended period of time, the person begins to live in that future worst case scenario biologically. And that creates anxiety, creates insomnia, it creates depression, it creates OCD and neurosis, because the body is moving into a vigilant state because it's been conditioned that way. How many people are with me? So the emotions then that are created by the hormones of stress have everything to do with aggression and anger and hatred and war and violence and frustration, of fear, of anxiety, of insecurity, of worry, of guilt, of shame, of hopelessness, of powerlessness, of depression, of envy, of jealousy. They are all created from the hormones of stress. And the latest research shows that human beings spend the minimum of 70% of their waking day being driven by those hormones of survival. And when those hormones are coursing through your circulatory system and those cocktail of chemicals are running, when those chemicals are released, the body gets a rush of energy. And human beings begin to become addicted to those emotions. And we use the problems and the conditions in our life to reaffirm our addiction to that emotion. The bad job, the poor relationship, all of those things, the difficult circumstances, because we're using those conditions in our external environment to reaffirm our own emotional addictions. So then if you can turn on the stress response just by thought alone, and those chemicals are very addictive, then we become addicted to our own thoughts. And when it comes time to change then, we can't get beyond the thought because that thought is being driven by a chemical that we're addicted to. And so the body, as I said last night, craves the chemicals just like an addict craves its chemicals. Now it's a scientific fact that living in emergency mode under the hormones of stress downregulates and dysregulates genes to create disease. Now, if those chemicals, this is science now, begin to push the genetic buttons that create disease, and you can turn on the stress response just by thought alone, then by very nature then, most people can get sick just by thinking. In other words, their thoughts can make them sick. So if your thoughts could make you sick, is it possible then that your thoughts could make you well? Poke the person next to you, please. Give them a poke. How many people are still with me? Now, when an organism in nature is living in survival, when you're in survival, you have to take care of yourself. And so most people in our culture are so seduced by their external environment. Bad news, war, terrorism, competition, all of those things. That's the social structure that keeps people living by these chemicals. And if you're living in survival, you got to take care of yourself, which means you become selfish. You become self-involved, self-centered, self-indulgent, self-serving, self-aggrandizing, self-important, self-pitying, because we define the self then as somebody who's threatened, somebody who's concerned about something terrible happening. Because in survival, if you pick the worst case scenario and get ready for it, and it doesn't occur, at least you're prepared for the worst case scenario to survive. In other words, in the infinite potentials that exist in the quantum field, you're selecting the worst possible potential. And you're emotionally embracing that and getting ready for it. And that's a poor imagination, would you agree? So then, When the zebra's being chased by the lion, she's concerned about three things. She's putting all of her awareness on her body. I got to take care of my body. She's putting all of her awareness in her environment. Where am I going to run? What direction am I going to go? What things are in my way? I got to pay attention. My brain is turned on, and I'm hyper alert and aroused for a few minutes, for the short term. And how much time do I have to get there? The body, the environment, and time. And when you and I live by the hormones of stress, which is 70% of the time or more, unless you're in a place like this, then we begin to become materialists. And we define our reality with our senses. And we believe that the outer world is more real than the inner world, because when you and I are living by stress, we obsess about our bodies. We obsess about the way we look, our weight. We obsess about the problems in our life. We obsess about objects and things, and we obsess about time. And we begin to believe that we're a body in the environment in time. And when the brain and body are knocked out of balance like that, and you're living by your senses, when you are living by your senses, you will feel more like particle and less like wave, more like matter and less like energy. You will feel more dense and less connected to something greater. You will feel separate from possibility, because when you're in survival, it's not a time to create. When you're in survival, it's not a time to learn. When you're in survival, it's not a time to trust in the unknown. It's time to run from the unknown. When you're in survival, it's not the time to go inward. And so then human beings become very selfish in their lives, and they begin to try to force the outcome in their life. They begin to try to control the outcome in their life. They begin to overanalyze their life because those chemicals are driving their brain into higher and higher imbalanced states. And we have measured this over and over again. And as I said last night, when you are analyzing your life within that emotion, you will make your brain and body worse. You will drive it into a higher state of imbalance. And so people become more and more out of balance, and they move further away from possibility and change. And so they begin to try to control the outcome and force the outcome, because they are matter trying to change matter. And when you're matter trying to change matter, you only have limited resources. You are going to compete, you're going to be manipulative, you're going to be cunning, you're going to lie, whatever it is to get what you want in survival, because the self comes first. Now imagine millions of people living that way because they're afraid of the next moment. And they have to cling to the familiar and cling to the known, because the unknown means there's danger out there. And how could they ever create anything new in their life? Because they're already predicting the feeling of the event. And if the feeling is a familiar feeling, then they could never create anything new. Now, did you ever notice when you're living in that state of survival that your mind is fragmented? Because the very chemicals cause different compartments of your brain that should be working together to begin to segregate, to begin to compartmentalize. And as the brain begins to compartmentalize, because those neighborhoods and communities of neurons have to take care of themselves. And so what happens in the brain is different compartments are now fighting against each other. And if you were to measure the brainwave patterns on someone in that state, the brainwave patterns are very incoherent, very out of balance. And when your brain is incoherent, you're incoherent. And when your brain is out of balance, you're out of balance. And when that occurs, then people are fragmented in their attention. And they're putting their attention on people and things and places and events in their life. And they're clinging to the knowns because the unknown is too scary. And that incoherent signature that's coming from the brain sends an incoherent signature down the central nervous system, which communicates with every other system. And the immune system gets a very, very incoherent message. And it starts making some pretty funny white blood cells. The digestive system now gets a very incoherent message, and its timing changes. Cardiovascular system, the rhythm between the heart and the brain becomes imbalanced, and now the body is living completely out of balance, because that imbalance is the now new balance, and the person is headed for some type of breakdown. Now, did you ever notice when you're in the creative state That if you're truly creating, you're completely in the present moment. And when you're completely in the present moment, you're so present and attentive to what you're doing that you forget about time and space. You forget about yourself. You become nobody. You become no one. You become no thing, nowhere, in no time. You become pure consciousness. And when you reach that elegant moment where you completely in the present moment, that's when the brain begins to become highly coherent. And all the energy that you've used in thought to reaffirm these survival centers, your sexual identity, your digestion, your pain, your power, your importance, all to reaffirm these centers, the moment your identity is gone and you go from selfish to selfless, the moment that occurs, the energy from these centers begins to move right into your heart. And we've measured this over and over again. And the moment that energy moves into your heart, you go from particle to wave. You go from matter to energy. And the field around your body, when you are living in stress, this invisible field that we've measured, the moment a person has a stress response, that energy is turned into chemistry. And their field is about this wide, about 4 inches. The moment that energy hits their heart, it can be up to 9 meters wide. Now there are more energy and less matter, and they feel connected to something greater. And they would never try to force the outcome. They would never try to control the outcome. They are connected to something greater, and they trust in the unknown. They've already experienced the event. And when that occurs, and you become nobody, no one, no thing, nowhere, in no time, that's the moment you walk through the door to the quantum field. You can't enter the door as a somebody. You have to enter as a nobody. And I have seen people try to change their brain with their brain. I have seen people try to change their ego with their ego. I have seen people try to change the program as a program. I have seen people try to change their personality as their personality. Matter never changes matter. It's that moment when you become pure consciousness, that consciousness is the epiphenomenon of matter. And the moment you slip out of your body and you forget about it, the moment you are no longer your profession, your gender, your culture, your religion, your problems, a mother, a son, a father, the moment you forget about being someone, the moment you're not connected to anything, in anywhere, no place, in no time, is the moment, we've seen it over and over again, that those different compartments of the brain that were once disintegrated start organizing. They start synchronizing. They start working together with each other. And the front of the brain starts talking to the back of the brain. The right side of the brain is now talking to the left side of the brain. This left corner is talking to the back right corner. And you start to see this psychic union going on in the brain. And if you turn around and follow the cord to the person in the meditation, this is what you see. And tears are running down their face, and they feel connected and humbled, connected to something greater. And that state where the brain is functioning, and that synchronized state, what syncs together in the brain, links together in the brain, and they feel so whole that they can no longer want anything. And I call that the natural state of being. And when they are so whole that they no longer want, they are outside of polarity, and that's the moment the magic happens. Because they're whole and connected to a vision, the vision or the experience is drawn to them. And so when people then can get beyond their emotional body, when they can get beyond their habits and their identities, when they're no longer preoccupied with the predictable future or the familiar past, when they're no longer a face or a gender, the moment they slip beyond that, that's the moment the magic occurs. So I want to show you some slides now to explain everything that I was talking about. So now, here's what I want you to do. I want you to keep one eye on the slide and then one eye on the person next to you. You got it? So, a little bit about brainwaves. You ready? You geniuses? Beta brain waves. When you are waking consciousness and you wake up in the morning and your eye starts to perceive daylight, the moment your eye picks up daylight, the optic nerve sends a signal right to the pineal gland, and the pineal gland begins to make a neurotransmitter called serotonin. And serotonin is the daytime neurotransmitter, and it creates excitatory function in the brain. And the moment the brain begins to fire in serotonin, you begin to pay attention to your outer world. And the brain perks up, and now the brain's job is to create meaning between the outer world and the inner world. And the way it does that is it uses its senses. And it's thinking about how it feels, if it's tired, if it's hungry, who's a threat, who they like, what things they have to do. And as that starts to happen, the brain waves in the neocortex, or the thinking brain, where conscious awareness exists, is very fast. Are you with me? Now, when you go to bed at night and light begins to diminish, I'm watching all of you, by the way, and your brain is perceiving less light, the signal that goes to the pineal gland takes serotonin and turns it into melatonin. And melatonin makes you sleepy and changes your brain waves. So we could say that Sarah gets you up in the morning and Mel puts you to bed at night. You got it? Now, think about this. If you want to be defined as thought alone, you have to become thought alone. And when you do that, and you close your eyes, and you sit in a meditation, and you put blindfolds on, or you close your eyes, you are disconnecting from your external environment. Your attention is no longer on the outer world because you're seeing less information, which is 80% of information, sensory-wise, comes through your eyes. You're playing music in the background, or you put earplugs in, or there's silence. Now you're hearing less information, and because of that, you're sitting your body down and you're making it sit still, disconnecting from your environment, putting your body in one place and transcending time. The moment that happens, your neocortex begins to slow its brain waves down, and your brain waves move into alpha. And in alpha, that's the imaginary world where the inner world is more real than the outer world. You could still hear the outer world, you could sense it, but more of your attention is in the inner world. How many people are with me? Now, if you allow your body to fall asleep, some of you are here there right now, and your mind is awake, that's called theta. That's what I call twilight. Now, if you've conditioned your body to be the mind, and your body is now asleep, it means it's no longer the mind, which means instantaneous change can happen. And when we studied our students in long meditation, we see these huge bursts of theta, really long, profound bursts of theta, and they are in the netherworld. And their body is resting, and their mind is awake. They're dreaming in that state. Now, if you miss that window and you miss that door, you move into delta. And delta is deep restorative sleep. Now, every now and then, we see this in our work a lot of times, you'll see what we call gamma brainwaves. Now, I call gamma brainwaves superconsciousness. And when that kundalini energy that's sitting in those lower centers that you use for sexual expression, to digest your food, all the energy you need to drive aggressively or tell your coworker off or being chased by a predator, all the energy that's sitting in these lower centers, instead of being eliminated out, begins to move up. And when that energy begins to move up, that sympathetic nervous system switches on right with the parasympathetic nervous system, and the body is relaxed, and just like an orgasm, that energy begins to release up into the brain. And there's a little gate at the brain stem called the thalamic gate. And the moment that gate opens up, that energy begins to move right into the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is sensitive to pressure. And all of a sudden, that pineal gland gets a rush of energy, and it compresses, and it begins to release electromagnetic energy. And the pineal gland begins to take melatonin and turn it into some very profound neurotransmitters. One of the neurotransmitters or metabolites is the most powerful antioxidant known to man. Anti-cancer, anti-aging, anti-heart disease, anti-stroke, antimicrobial, anti-neurodegenerative, all created from these three metabolites. And because energy now is interacting with the pineal gland, the moment that happens, the analytical mind is anesthetized. The thinking brain is shut down. If you take that molecule and you tweak it again, you find the same chemical found in hibernating animals. Now, why is that important? Because if you're sitting down and you're in a meditation and that chemical is released, you will have no drives. No appetite, no sex drive, no need to move. The body goes into stasis. If you take that molecule and you tweak it again, you will find the same chemical found in electric eels, a phospholuminescent chemical. And we have measured amplitudes of energy in our work 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, 26,000 times, 40,000 times normal in the brain. And that's because when that neurotransmitter is released and that electrical current begins to activate the nervous system, all of a sudden you're tuning in to possibility, and now the brain and nervous system is processing a greater stream of consciousness, and those microtubules in the cells turn on. If you take that same molecule and you tweak it again, you'll find the most powerful hallucinogenic known to man. Now, why is that important? Because the moment that occurs in gamma, what you're experiencing in your inner world is more real than anything you've ever experienced in your outer world, and you'll never forget that moment. And the brain literally tracks it neurologically and produces a new chemical, and the moment that occurs, the body moves out of the past. And we have seen people heal themselves instantaneously when this energy is released. I'll show you the pictures tomorrow night. So then, gamma then is superconsciousness. It's when the sympathetic nervous system begins to release energy back to the brain, and all the energy you've used to create a baby, to digest food, to run from a predator, is now moving up to the brain from whence it came. And when that occurs, the brain goes into a heightened state, and that's called gamma. So, we talked about this a little bit last night. From the ages of 0 to 2, children, for the most part, are functioning in delta brainwave patterns. They're asleep with their eyes open. Between the ages of 2 and 6, their brainwaves move into theta, which means they're in twilight. And if you ever see a child 2 or 3 years old, they're tracking things around the room that you can't see because they're in a lucid state. Now, between the ages of 0 and 6 years old, their brain is completely in the subconscious state, and all of their attention is on their inner world and not on their outer world. As they begin to learn the laws of the environment, their brainwaves move into alpha. So for the first 6 years of their life, they're in an imaginary state. And so then in alpha, they pretend, they play, they begin to interact with their outer world, and they're paying attention to their inner world. And so as they begin to learn from different things in their environment, they notice a change in their internal chemical state. They're altered in some way. It wakes them up, and they pay attention to whoever or whatever caused that. And because their awareness is now going more on their outer environment, their brainwaves move into alpha. After the age of 12, the door kind of shuts, and now they move into beta consistently. And beta, as I said, is when the outer world is more real than the inner world. So most of you, but not all of you, are functioning for the most part in low-level beta. You're relaxed and you're paying attention to what I'm saying, and because you're relaxed and paying attention, your brain is not threatened in any way, and you're absorbing information. But here's what most of you do when I'm developing a concept or an idea, and you find it particularly interesting. You go from beta to alpha, and you go like this. And the moment you do that, you're consolidating that information neurologically in your brain. And so in order for you to learn, you have to switch from beta to alpha. Now, if I said to you, oh my God, I forgot to tell you, there's a 50-question test that you have to take before you leave. And if you can pass it, you have to stay in here till tomorrow. Your brain would perk up a little bit more, and you'd start paying attention, like we took the light bulb and made it a little bit brighter. But when you are freaked out and emotional or anxious or fearful or angry, you move into high-level beta. And look at high-level beta compared to mid-range beta. It's twice as high. Now, in this state, you understand that it's not a time to learn. It's not a time to trust. It's not a time to communicate. You're not going to say to the predator, come here, sweetheart, I trust you, if it's a lion. You're not going to do that, right? You're less likely to trust in that state. So, We can't learn in this state because no new information will come into your nervous system that isn't equal to the emotion that you're experiencing. So most people take drugs, or they overdo something, or drink alcohol to sedate the body, to relax it so they can drop down those stages. So the job then is to enter the kingdom of heaven. You have to become like a child again. You with me? So let this circle represent your mind. And when you're born, you're totally subconscious mind. How do we know that? Because we just study the brain waves, and for the first 7 to 12 years of your life, your brain is in a subconscious state. And you learn by these positive and negative identifications and associations. A good example of a positive identification is when you're young and you're hungry and you cry out for food. You learn to associate crying out with being fed, so every time you're hungry, you cry out and you're fed. So you notice a disturbance or discomfort in your inner environment, and you take an action, and when you do that action, you get feedback, and you hear your mother's voice or the smell of breast milk, and so you correlate that discomfort with a change in discomfort, and you associate your mother with pleasure or comfort. A good example of a negative association is when you put your finger on the stove. The moment you put your finger on the stove or in the light socket, you notice a change in your internal chemistry. And the moment you wake up, you see what caused it. And you begin to develop what we call habits and behaviors. So right around the age of 6 to 9 years old, we begin to form the analytical mind. Now, the analytical mind separates the conscious mind from the subconscious mind. Now, the conscious mind, as I've been saying all along, is 5% of your total mind, and your subconscious mind is made up, your conscious mind is made up of things like logic and reasoning, which give rise to your creativity, your will, and your faith. Now, your subconscious mind is made up of 95% of who you are by the time you're 35 years old, and it's made up of all these habits and behaviors. Now, this analytical mind is always working in your conscious state. You're always evaluating because your brain is divided in half, good and bad, right and wrong, positive and negative, male and female, past and future, and the brain then is always analyzing. Now, the analytical mind is healthy if you're learning something, if you're discerning ethically the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, if you're finding your way in your life, you need your analytical mind. But when the hormones of stress are now running through your circulatory system, the analytical mind goes into high gear. And when that happens, it begins to endorse the ego, and we become high aroused. And when that occurs, we move into high beta. And if we move into high beta, we're moving further away from the operating system where true change can take place. You with me? Now, the whole purpose of meditation, then, is to get beyond the analytical mind and enter the operating system and begin to change these negative or unhealthy habits and behaviors into more productive ones. How many people understand? So, some people have a very thin analytical mind, and because they have a very thin analytical mind, they tend to slip past their conscious mind very naturally. Other people who've had a lot of education and have studied a lot, they have a little thicker analytical mind, and they have to work a little harder to get past it. Are you with me? So is there anything wrong with the analytical mind? No. It's just that you have to know how to get beyond it. So the more analytical you are, the less suggestible you are to your own thoughts. The less analytical you are, the more suggestible you are to your own thoughts. And what I've learned over the years is people are the most suggestible to the thoughts that are equal to their emotional state. If they feel unworthy, they'll accept, believe, and surrender to the thoughts equal to that emotional state, and they'll program their autonomic nervous system into that destiny. Which means then they are less suggestible to the thoughts about empowerment and change if they're living by guilt, shame, or unworthiness. Change a person's emotional state into gratitude, into joy, and into freedom, and they'll accept, believe, and surrender to those thoughts equal to their emotional state, and they'll program their autonomic nervous system into a different destiny. And we've measured the epigenetic changes as a result of it. So then, the whole purpose here is to move from high beta into mid-range beta into low-level beta right past the analytical mind. And the moment that happens, your brain waves change to alpha. And if you do it properly, you'll create very coherent brainwave patterns in alpha, and moving down past the analytical mind into theta and to some deep unconscious levels. So here's my question. If you're sitting in a meditation tomorrow, and you notice that you start getting frustrated or impatient, what brainwave patterns are you moving into? High beta. Would you agree? If you're sitting there thinking, when's this going to be over? I don't know if I can do this any longer. I'm tired. When's the bell going to ring? You start thinking that way. Am I doing this right? And you start analyzing yourself and your life. What brainwave pattern did you just move into? Beta. Would you agree? And you're moving away from the operating system where true change takes place. So what if then you noticed you were getting a little vigilant or getting a little impatient, and you became aware that you were doing that, and you realized that was the body as the mind being conditioned the wrong way, and you settled the body back down into the present moment, and you surrendered back into possibility. Would you agree that every time you did that, you were tempering the body and training the body and reconditioning the body to a new mind and liberating energy? And we've measured this over and over again. Don't think that when you're sitting there and your body is raging and it's telling you, you can't, it's too hard, I want to quit, I can't do this, and you're sitting there and you're observing those thoughts and you're not putting your attention behind them, don't think that you are not in the process of change. Because every time you overcome just that one thought, you are no longer firing and wiring the same circuits in your brain, and you are no longer emotionally signaling the same genes in the same way, and you're liberating energy, and the body's being freed from the chains of the past. So the flow of consciousness then, the movement of consciousness, is moving out of the thinking brain, the neocortex, and closer into the limbic brain, where those subconscious and autonomic functions begin to take place. And I'll show you what it looks like when we measured autonomic changes tomorrow. So our groove then is to go from beta to what? And we would call that alpha 2 and theta 2. And we could say then that beta and alpha represent the conscious mind, and alpha, theta, and delta represent the subconscious mind. How many people are with me? Poke the person next to you, please. Gamma superconsciousness, it doesn't fit in that model. Now, take a look at this. When you're living by the hormones of stress, you produce very incoherent brainwave patterns because different compartments are not working together because it's not a time to communicate. It's time for emergency. And when you measure those brainwave patterns, they're very incoherent. When you begin to connect to source, when you truly allow that consciousness, your subjective free-willed consciousness, to merge with that objective consciousness, which is a loving intelligence and intelligent love, and you begin to merge with it, different compartments of your brain that were once divided begin to work together and synchronize. And when that occurs, you start to feel whole, you start to feel more love for your life, you feel more spontaneous, more poised, you feel clear, you trust in the universe because your brain is now functioning in a holistic state. And as I said last night, all of those people that had spontaneous remissions that we measured over and over again, they reached a point where they were so whole and so happy with themselves and their life, they could care less if they had the disease, is the moment the disease went away. So here you go. When you perceive a threat from your external environment, you begin to recognize that that's a predator. Your association centers in your brain, through your frontal lobe, sends a signal to the limbic brain. The limbic brain then sends an electrical signal down the central nervous system. It begins to activate the adrenal glands, and the adrenal glands begin to squirt out adrenaline. Once the adrenaline is released, it becomes liquid energy, and your body begins to physiologically change. You get a rush of energy, your pupils dilate because you want to see what's going on in your external environment. Your salivary juices shut off. It's not a time to eat dinner. Your heart rate increases. Your respiratory rate increases, and blood is sent to your extremities, and you're prepared for an emergency, and your body's knocked out of balance. But it doesn't have to be a lion. It could be your mother-in-law. And the same exact thing would happen because of some past experiences. Now you're reacting as if your mother-in-law is a predator. and you produce the same chemical reaction unconsciously, and you will use your mother-in-law to reaffirm your addiction to judgment, to envy, to hatred, to whatever it is emotionally, and you turn on that fight or flight nervous system, and you're knocking yourself out of balance. And when those chemicals are running, there'll always be a gap between the way things appear and the way things really are. And if you act during that refractory period, you'll always say the same thing. I should have never said that. I should have never done that. I should have never thought that. I should have never sent that nasty email. Because you were altered in that state. How many people are with me? My staff calls it, when they get the emails, she took the poison. Now, you don't even have to see your mother-in-law. What? I don't know what happened there. So there's another nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system, and that's a nervous system of relaxation. This is when your body goes into growth and repair, into long-term building projects. And in that state, all the energy now is being used for restoration and health. So if 70% of the time, for most people that are living in the emergency mode, they don't have a lot of energy for healing. How many people understand? So we live in two states of mind, right? The animal part of us, who's living in survival, will always live in stress. They'll be in contraction. There'll be tissue breakdown. They'll be degenerating. They'll feel fear or anger or sadness. They'll become selfish. They'll put their attention on their body, the environment, and time. Energy is always lost in survival. A person is living in emergency mode. They become very object-focused. They focus on the particle. They focus on matter. They focus on things because they're using their senses to define reality. They feel separate from possibility. They're determining reality by their senses. They're living by cause and effect. They're only seeing limited possibilities because they're projecting the future from the past. The brain is very incoherent, and they'll always focus on the knowns. Our divine nature, then, who we really are, is when we're in the creative state. The body is in homeostasis. Instead of contraction, there's expansion. Instead of catabolism or tissue breakdown, there's anabolism, tissue repair. There's health, there's order, there's regeneration. The emotions of love, joy, trust, knowingness, gratitude, heartfelt emotions tend to create more balanced states. The person goes from selfish to selfless. They become no thing, no body, no time. Energy is always generated in the system because they're connected to source. There's growth and repair. Their focus goes from narrow focus to a very broad and open focus. They see possibilities. They're not defining reality by their senses. They're beyond their senses. They're causing an effect instead of living by effect. Their brain is very coherent, and they love the unknown, and they embrace adventure. Now, learning is making new synaptic connections. Every time you learn something new, this happens in your brain. You have a physical change as a result of your interaction in your environment, and that is called learning. If you learned anything this week at all, and you're able to repeat it, you have a physical change in your brain, and you are not the same person that arrived. One whole network of neurons connecting with a whole other network of neurons. The sum of the parts is greater than the whole in the brain. You have a clear understanding, and you are enlightened. This is change, unhooking from the old self, reconnecting to the new self. This is real time, by the way. This is a new experience, jungles of neurons organizing themselves into networks to reflect the event in the external environment, and the brain begins to upscale its hardware. How many people are with me? It happens faster. I've slowed it down a little. Real time. Now, if learning is making new synaptic connections, then remembering is maintaining and sustaining those connections. Once those connections are now formed, you have a long-term relationship. And if you keep firing and you keep wiring, those nerve cells, just like any relationship, are bonded because they've communicated over and over again. How many people are with me? Now, this could be joy, it could be pain, it could be how to drive a stick shift, it could be how to complain. They're fired and wired. Now, your frontal lobe is your creative center. It's where you demonstrate free will. This is the boss, the CEO. This is where you learn. This is where you have intention. This is where you invent. This is where you have attention. This is where you speculate possibilities. This is where you decide on your actions and make decisions. You control your behavior. You have focused concentration, and you restrain your emotional reactions. It's 40% of your entire brain, and that's what separates us from all other species on the planet. And when you're sitting in a meditation, this is the part of your brain that should be lighting up, because you are no longer allowing yourself to run as an automatic program. Now, let's just say when you're truly focused and you're truly paying attention, the frontal lobe acts like a volume control. And what it loves to do, like a great symphony leader, when you're paying attention to a single-minded thought, the frontal lobe doesn't want to be distracted by anything else. And because it has connections to all other parts of the brain, when you are sitting in meditation and you are putting your attention on your inner world, it begins to silence the circuits in your motor cortex, and you become very still. It shuts the lights out in the sensory centers, and you no longer feel your body. And if there's no brain activity in the sensory centers, then you are no body. It cools off the circuits in the parietal lobe and the orienting area, and all of a sudden you lose track of time and space. It shuts off the visual cortex. You no longer see anything with your eyes. It turns off the lights in the association centers. You're no longer an identity. And it begins to temper those emotions in the limbic brain. And the moment that occurs, the thought that you're thinking literally is the experience in your mind. And the brain upscales itself to reflect the thought as the experience. And you begin to change biologically. How many people are with me? 2 more slides or so and I'm done. This is when you begin to speculate, what is compassion? Well, I listened to one of my teachers. They told me what compassion was. I read the book. I saw the video. And you begin to ask, what is compassion? The frontal lobe then begins to call up different networks of neurons that you've either learned or experienced in your life. So what is compassion? The frontal lobe then begins to call up a neurological network because you read a book. Once you begin to think about the book, then you thought, well, my Aunt Mary was pretty compassionate. I remember her. Oh, yeah, I saw the video with the Dalai Lama on compassion. He's a pretty compassionate guy. Oh, I had that experience in my life where I felt compassion. Ooh, boy, do I have a lot of compassion for myself. And the moment you turn on all those circuits, you produce an internal representation, and that's called an intention, and you get a picture in your mind. And the clearer you are, and the more you learn, the more you can refine that picture. So then, if nerve cells that fire together wire together, then nerve cells that no longer fire together no longer wire together. It's called the universal law. Use it or lose it. I call this the science of changing your mind or throwing out the mental trash. Here you go. You're going to think a new thought called, I am healthy, I am happy, I'm in love with life. You're going to signal a new set of neurons in your brain, and you're going to activate a new network of neurons. And it's going to be this blue neuron right here. You with me? So this is the new thought. You're going to say, I am compassionate, or I am happy, or I am joyful, or I'm in love with life. You close your eyes, you begin the internal process, and you begin to fire that thought. But there's only one problem. You know what it is? You got all these other circuits firing at the same time. And in the midst of you firing this new thought called, I am happy, or I am joyful, or I'm compassionate, you got all these other voices going on saying, you're not very happy, you're a loser. You're too much like your mother. You'll never change. Look at you. You're failing miserably here. And what about the pain in your back? All of those voices are old circuits firing and wiring in your brain. Are you with me? Now, we have this amazing faculty as human beings. It's our will. And our will is connected to our spirit. And if you keep firing that thought over and over again, and you keep firing it, and you keep insisting that that is the thought you want in the front and center stage of your mind, and you keep doing it, this will become the loudest voice and the loudest signal in your brain. And the moment this is the loudest signal in your brain, you have the nerve impulse firing down this way, but you have the glue that keeps the neurons connected firing in the opposite direction. So watch. You keep firing the thought, and all of a sudden, this becomes the loudest thought in your mind, and watch what happens. Boom. Now, this thought, I am joyful, or I am compassionate, is louder than these other voices. And because this is the strongest signal, now the nerve cell has to wire to this one and glue itself together. But there's only a certain amount of glue to go around. So it starts to steal the glue from the neighboring circuits to connect this circuit. And as it begins to connect this circuit, it begins to disconnect the other circuits because you're no longer paying attention to those thoughts. And so then as you begin to fire and wire this circuit, there goes the voice that you're too much like your mother. There goes the voice that you have pain in your back. There's the voice that you'll never change. And all of a sudden, the only signal that's traveling to this neuron is called joy. And we call this pruning in neuroscience, and this is exactly what happens in transformation. Now think about this. Where every neuron is connected to another neuron is called a memory. If those circuits are pruned apart, then the memory of the old self literally no longer exists. And where is that memory stored? In the soul is wisdom. And that's the name of the game. So here's the question. Can you believe in a future that you can't see or experience with your senses yet, but you've thought about enough times in your mind that your brain is literally changed to look like the experience has already occurred? It's absolutely possible. And can you emotionally embrace a future potential that already exists in the quantum field so many times that your body, as the unconscious mind, begins to believe it's living in that future in the present moment, and you're conditioning your body to signal new genes in new ways so that your body begins to change to look like the experience has already occurred? Absolutely. So think about this. If so, your brain and body are physically changed ahead of the actual experience. You just move from living in your past to living in your future. In fact, you are ahead of your time. And when you successfully apply this new paradigm, your brain and body are no longer a record of the past, but now, in fact, a map to the future. And to live by this law is to live by the quantum law. And the quantum law says your environment is an extension of your mind. And if you truly change your mind, there should be evidence in your life. How many people understand? Last slide, some simple instructions on how to handle change in your life on your message machine on your cell phone or your recording. I'm not available right now, but thank you for caring enough to call. I'm making some changes in my life. Please leave a message after the beep. If I don't return your call, you are one of the changes. Thanks for listening.